members of my family and friends over the years have encouraged me to do this, to do a reflection on my ministry, my ministry as a priest over the past years. You know, as life changes for us, different things happen. And I think that for me, at least, the last part of life is really the part of gratitude and thanksgiving. And so part of what I'm going to do with this is going to reflect on some aspects of my past, and to do it in a spirit of giving thanks, to do it in the spirit of gratitude for the gift that God has given. I was born in 1942. It was Second World War time. Very quickly after I was born, my father was drafted into the service. And so my mother and I lived on the second floor, the upper part of my grandparents' home for a couple of years while Dad was in the service. This was on West 7th Street, St. Francis de Sales Parish. It was the place where my father had grown up. And in fact, even to this day, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of families in that parish that come from the same one-horse town in Austria. They can all trace their lineage back to that one-horse town. And my dad was one of those people whose family came from that little town of Apeldoorn. Well, after my dad returned, and my brother Mike was born, then we moved from West 7th Street, we moved to 1515 Lincoln Avenue. And we lived there for just a couple of years. And then from that moved into the Mac Groveland area on Sargent Avenue. I come from a family in which religious values, being part of the church, being part of the church community, was really at the heart of my parents' life and the kind of life that they handed on to me and my sisters and brothers. To be close to the church, to regard the church as your home, was in a sense the image that was given to me. My grade school years were spent at Nativity School in St. Paul. Large enrollment at that time. A significant person in my life was the principal of that school, Sister Carolyn Whitman. We used to have children's mass one day a week at 8 o'clock in the morning, when music would be part of the mass and it would be much more celebrative. And so there had to be a hymn board put together as to what the hymns would be, and I was kind of picked to be the hymn board person. So I would go to Sister Carolyn's office and the night before the Mass, and she'd give me the list of songs, and then I had to put the numbers on the proper place on the board. And she showed me how to do it. She showed me how to do it. And I found it difficult to remember, or if not remember, just difficult to do it. And I can recall one day just throwing up my hands and saying to her, "I can't do this, you're going to have to do it." And she looked at me and very calmly said, "Stephen, you can do it. I'm going to show you again how to do it, and then you will do it." Well, that opened up to me a whole specter about what life was about. That what this lady was doing is she was leading me into taking charge in my life, of being responsible, of being an actor, of having a role to play, and of being secure about that and being sure of that. Well, that was one of the earliest, and I think for me at least one of the most profound influences in my life was that afternoon in her office. Because what I learned was that even though I have spent more than 50 years as a priest of the church, and even though I have spent as a priest of the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, and even though that I'm responsible to the leadership of the bishop, there is something about my responsibility that flows out of me. There's something about living my life with some integrity from within. As a result, I've really developed kind of a paradigm for ministry. I try to listen to what the person is asking of me. And I try to listen beyond the words that are spoken, but to listen for what's underneath. To listen for what may be the motivation of this. And then I see my job, apart from the person asking me to do some outlandish thing or some illegal thing or some immoral thing, I see my responsibility as to find a way in which that can occur for that person. You know, my job is not to protect the church. My job is not to protect Jesus. My job is not to enforce church law. My job is to provide an opportunity, a leadership opportunity that draws people into the place that they want and need to be. In a sense, I learned later on what that was all about. From my earliest days, I was taught about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But then later on in my life, in my middle years, I learned about the iron rule. And the iron rule is never, ever do something for another that person can do for themselves. Never, ever do something for a person that they could readily do themselves. And that made a huge difference in my life as to how I looked upon my ministry, how I looked upon my interactions with people, that I'm not a caretaker of people's lives. I'm there to facilitate and to encourage and to animate. So that philosophy, if you will, was powerful for me. It was powerful for me. As I grew up, the parish priest played a significant role in the life of our family. And as a student in a parochial school, I had the opportunity to rub shoulders with or elbows with the priests of the parish. And there were 4 or 5 of them in the parish at that time. I had always, not always, but I had come to think about the priesthood as being a possible road for me to follow. As I say, because of the closeness that we had with priests. And I think it was priests because of the priests I knew made a difference in people's lives. The priests I knew made a difference in my parents' life and in the life of our family. And that became important to me, that I wanted to do something, I wanted to be in a way that actually made a difference, that actually contributed to the lives of people. Now at that time, the auxiliary bishop, Bishop Byrne, was the pastor of the parish. And when I was in 8th grade, a half a dozen of us were chosen to serve the conclusion of 40 hours devotion. And this was in the spring of the year, probably March. And after the ceremony was over and the procession was over and all of that, we were back in the sacristy before, and there were all kinds of priests invited to this event, because the culture at the time was that, pastors would invite the neighboring clergy in, and they would participate in the closing of 40 hours devotion. There would also be a meal served. It was an opportunity for some kind of fellowship. So there were these priests in the sacristy, and Bishop Byrne was taking off his vestments, and then as he saw me and Jim Hudson and Frank Fried kind of moving out of the room, he called us back. And he called us up to himself, and he stood us in front of him. And he put his arms around the three of us, kind of held us in, and he announced to those priests, now these three men are going to Nazareth Hall next year. I had never said that. I had never made that decision. He just announced it. And then he said to me, now, Stephen, when you go home, I want you to tell your mother and dad that I'd like to see them about 7 o'clock tomorrow night. So I did. And of course, they spent a sleepless night wondering what I had done that the bishop was now going to call them in. Well, they went in and they had this visit with Bishop Byrne, and basically what he was doing is he was encouraging them to encourage me. And to not stand in my way, to be not to force me, but to be open and receptive to a decision. And so I ended up, going to Nazareth Hall, and it was almost by fluke. Had that opportunity for the closing of 40 hours devotion not taken place, and those circumstances not being there, who knows if anyone would have ever suggested that to me. So that certainly was an influence in my life. It certainly was a profound influence in my life. But more than that, it was the example of priests that had served in that parish and had been priests to our family. My uncle was a priest. He's since passed away. Lived to well over 100, not well over 100, he lived to be over 100. And up to being 100, he continued to practice ministry. He celebrated Mass every Sunday at the church in Arizona. Anyway, he was part of the family. He was around a lot. And he certainly was an influence. I remember in kindergarten, we had a kindergarten band, and I was to play the bird whistle. It was a thing with water in it that you blew in it, and it kind of chirped like a bird. And I invited my uncle to come to the performance. And he said he would come, but then something came up and he didn't come. So after the performance, my mom was there, and there was some socializing going on, and Bishop Byrne came around, and he patted kids on the head, and he said, how are you, and what's going on? And he said to me, he said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I thought I wanted to be a priest like my uncle, but he didn't come here, so I want to be a bishop like you. I can't recall what his reaction was, but he probably was taken back. So, the presence of priests in my life. Oh, and a fairly significant event occurred when I was in grade school. Father Clarence Steiner was one of the priests. He was the senior assistant at the parish. And a block and a half away from the church, an interracial couple purchased a home. And the suggestion was that this was done deviously, that the white partner came and negotiated all the things, and it was only after it was signed, sealed, and delivered that the African-American husband and the kids arrived. And so the neighbors were not all that pleased. In fact, they became rather active in trying to get that family to move out of the neighborhood. And there were some demonstrations that took place in front of those people's house. Not huge, but, you know, a couple dozen individuals, and they were saying some pretty crude things to these people. And there was one afternoon when this was going on, and Father Steiner showed up. And he walked through the crowd, and he walked to the front steps of the house, and he stood between the husband and wife. And then he said to those people gathered, he said, "You're members of the parish. You come to church every week. Now you owe these people an apology. And if you're unwilling to do that, you don't need to come back to Nativity Parish." An incredibly strong statement. He stood his ground, and people quietly, with their tail between their legs, kind of moved off. And that was, for me, that was also a powerful image of a parish priest making a difference, and calling men and women, calling neighbors to a true understanding of what their faith was all about. So I had the opportunity as a seminarian to leave the seminary during the summer months and to obtain a degree, a master's degree. Archbishop Binns decided that he wanted some seminarians, some diocesan seminarians each year to begin the study for a master's degree, and he opened up huge areas in which study could take place, because he said he wanted an educated presbyterate. He wanted a presbyterate in which of people who had achieved educationally some standards. Well, I went to the University of Notre Dame to study liturgy. And one of the reasons I did that, one of the reasons I chose to do that, there were other opportunities that were offered to me, other suggestions that were made to me. One of the reasons I did that was because of a religion teacher I had in high school, and that was Father Tom Conroy. Tom had been through the Notre Dame program, and Tom had spoken very highly of that program. But Tom was the one who introduced me to liturgy. Tom was the one who opened my eyes to see how the liturgy of the church was at the very center of what it was to be church. Not just at the center of prayer, but the center of the very existence. The very nature of church was found wrapped up in its public worship. And the opportunity to be engaged in that for a community, to be the celebrant of those mysteries of faith for a community, became more and more and more powerful in my life. And so I wanted to go, and I wanted to get what Tom had. I wanted to study those same things, hoping that I might be able to drink up that understanding. And so I spent four wonderful summers at Notre Dame University, studying under some of the finest teachers, of most of them from Europe, who came to teach those summer school courses. And that was a big piece of my formation, not only the seminary in St. Paul, but the experience at Notre Dame. Out of that experience, I established some friendships. I certainly established interests that were not mine going into it. And out of that experience, as I entered into priesthood, there were pieces of that Notre Dame experience that that followed me and that urged me. This was the early 60s. 1963, the Civil Rights Voting Act was passed. And I remember it was signed into law while I was a student at Notre Dame, and I remember gathering with other people around the television and watching Lyndon Johnson sign that piece of legislation into law. Well, I became a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at that same time because of opposition to the war in Vietnam. And I found that the human rights, the civil rights, the anti-war, those efforts really did flow out of what we did on Sunday as we gathered around the table of the Lord. That the Eucharist was meant to impel us out and to challenge us and charge us to be witnesses to the loving mercy and saving grace and gentle justice and charity of God. And that is to take place within the confines of one's daily life. That really the fruit of the Eucharist takes place outside of church. It takes place in our relationships with each other and in our efforts to bring something to each other. And that, for me, that insight was really born from me at the University of Notre Dame, and not only the classes I took, but also the experiences I had of being tied into movements, social movements, but religious movements as well. There's a religious foundation to the quest for peace and the ending of conflict. There's a religious foundation to human rights and civil rights. There's a practical recognition of us all being made in the image and likeness of God, and how that needs to be protected and how that needs to be witnessed to. I was ordained December 8th of 1968. My classmates were ordained in March of that year. The ordinations generally were in March before Lent, so that the newly ordained priests could be used to go out and cover in parishes during the season of Lent. But I wasn't ordained in March. I was ordained in December, and the issue was that well, I was really rather independent. I didn't always do what the life of the house was all about. I wasn't always on time with stuff. Being on time was not a huge thing for me, and I didn't always complete work around areas that I didn't think were important. I'd kind of slough off on that regard. Well, the faculty got really nervous about that you know, I wasn't very punctual, and I wasn't always attentive to detail. And so they told me that I wouldn't be ordained, and I would be I've given the opportunity of serving as a deacon in a parish for a while to see if perhaps I really ought to be ordained or not. I was told that I needed to learn to be on time, and I needed to learn to be efficient. That those were the two big qualities that I needed to develop if I was going to be a priest. So I did. I spent 6 months with Father Jerry Keefe at St. William's in Fridley, and Jerry wrote a lovely letter saying, you know, I certainly could be on time, and I certainly attended to all kinds of things. He kind of gave an okay to me. And then the Archbishop agreed that I should be ordained, and so I was ordained 6 or 8 months after my classmates, after I had learned to be on time. Throughout my priesthood, participation in public life was also a part of me. In the beginning, when I was first ordained, there was the Twin City, the TCO, the Twin City organization, which was an organization of churches that sought to create opportunities for the movement of values in government that would benefit average people, homeowners, people in the community, you know, issues around at that point around redlining, around breaking certain areas of the city and allowing only certain people to live in those areas. Anyway, I was part of that, and that was important to me. That was that moved me in some ways. As a college student, I had also joined in with the Young Christian Workers. The Young Christian Workers were an organization, Young Christian Students, Christian Family Movement. This was a movement in which people would come together once a week or once every 2 weeks. They would study the scriptures, they would reflect on their own lives, they would see how the scriptures applied to their life, they would take an action, and they would go forth and they would do whatever the action was, and then they'd come back, and at the next meeting, one of the things they would do at the beginning would be to report on that action. Well, Father Ed Flavin put together an opportunity for seminarians during the summer months to form their own Catholic Action Group, their own Young Christian Workers Group. And there was a house just down from the cathedral called St. Pius X House, and it was that house that the Young Christian Workers owned, and in which people who were coming into town from the farm and looking for jobs young men could often find a place to room and board there for a while they got themselves going. Anyway, the meetings took place there, and there were older people who were in their late 20s and early 30s and mid 30s who were part of the organization, and they became an influence in our lives because of the experience they brought to us, and because of the encouragement that they gave to us. I mean, what they saw is that these were young guys who were in the seminary and who were looking to be priests, and if they could imbue them with some sense of this movement, perhaps as the years go on, there would be a lot of support for this movement among clergy. And so I participated in that, and that was an important part. That was a formative part for me. There was a time when there was an office in the Archdiocese called the Urban Affairs Office, and it was really the arm of the church looking into the areas of racism and poverty and those social issues that gripped us in the 60s and the early 70s in a very strong way. And Ed Flavin was the director. He was the founder and the director, and he left the office and he went to St. Peter Claver Church as a parish priest. And Sister Jan Matheson came and took over the office, and she worked the office for a number of years. And I was involved on the fringe anyway of what was going on. And I was really taken by the power that this office could have, the potential that this office could have. And Jan Matheson said she was going to resign. She was going to go back to her order, and she had some other things that her order wanted her to do. And so there would be an opening, and there would be a process by which the job would be filled. And I thought about it, and then in a moment of enthusiasm, I wrote a letter to Archbishop John Roach, and I said, you know, I'd really be interested in doing that. And I didn't get an answer from him. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, he and I were together at Mary's shelter for a Mass. And he pulled me aside and he said, Steve, I got your letter. And, you know, if you really want to do that, you know, I'm fine. You know, just go ahead and do it. You know, I'm okay with that. But he said, I want to warn you. You know, if you do take that position, you work very closely with me and you work under my thumb. He said, and so you've got to stand for what I stand for. But he said, I don't know if I want you to do that. He said, I think you're better than that. And so I want to keep you at arm's length from me so that I'm not on top of you and that you have the freedom to do what you feel you need to do in order to advance the work of the community. And so I said, fine, I'm glad to do that. Now, some people wonder why it is that I stayed at St. Matthew's as long as I did. Well, part of it is that story. John Roach said, you know, keep a distance from me. Do your ministry. You've got good instincts, you've got good opportunities, you've got a good experience. Go ahead and do your ministry. You don't have to be so close to the central corporation. And so I did, and there was never a push for me to move out of this community, out of the city of St. Paul, out of urban ministry. All my life was spent in urban ministry, either in 10 years in South Minneapolis or, you know, the rest of my ministry here in St. Paul at St. Matthew's. And so it was kind of with the tacit encouragement of John Roach that I stayed where I was. And he helped me. He facilitated. He was a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and the Chamber of Commerce ran a program for young leaders, and he was the one who propositioned me into participating in that program. He said, I want you to meet people, I want you to rub shoulders with people, I want you to get to know people, especially people who are making decisions about the life of the city. Well, that opened some doors for me as to how I was going to do my ministry. It also opened some doors for the parish. St. Matthew's was not a wealthy parish. We operated in a kind of hand-to-mouth operation. And there were many times when we had unbalanced budgets. And in effect, the diocese had to carry us a bit. And the Archbishop never made a big issue out of that. He said he was concerned about it, but he never made a big issue about it because he said, what you people are doing is so terribly important, and I wouldn't want to lose that as part of the life of the West Side community, the city of St. Paul. A piece of my life as a priest has been really around the study, the reflection, and the preaching of the Scriptures. I think that I probably spend an hour or two a day in reflecting on the Scriptures, on studying the Scriptures, on working with commentaries on the Scriptures. So a lot of it is building homilies, preparing to preach. But just as much as for my own gratification and satisfaction of coming to a deeper appreciation and a deeper knowledge of the Word of God. preaching has been a significant piece of my life, and a piece that I really enjoy, that I really relish. In fact, if I had to give a headline to my ministry, it would be that I'm a teaching pastor or a preaching pastor. That's what imbues who I am. I've also been graced in so many ways by opportunities to celebrate the sacraments with varying groups, varying groups of people. I think of those people whose funerals I've been able to preside at, and whose burials I've been able to preside at. The opportunity to give thanks for each of them individually for the gift that they have brought to a parish community, for the gift that they have brought to me. Those are strong pieces of my life. I have a principle that anyone who wants to get buried here can get buried here. The only caveat is they have to be dead. You know, and if they meet that threshold, I've never turned away anyone. I've never turned anyone for burial. I have never turned away anyone for baptism. That I do believe that even if the faith is rather thin or rather small in the lives of parents, nevertheless the faith is there. And what I do is I trust that by the grace of baptism, something will occur, something faith-oriented will occur in that young person's life, in that child's life. And that's what I pray for as I celebrate the sacrament of baptism. When I was much younger, I used to take the child in my arms and lift the child high after the sacrament, and I would say to the child, I would whisper to the child, "This may not be for today, but my prayer is that somewhere down the line in your life, what we have just done will make a profound difference." And then I'd hand the child back to their mom or dad. The Eucharist, I don't know if there's any day that I haven't celebrated the Eucharist, and sometimes 2 and 3 and 4 times. I'm willing to celebrate the Eucharist anytime there's a need on a part of a group of people. And part of that celebration of the Eucharist is really the opportunity again to read the Word of God, to reflect on the Word of God, to seek to break apart the Word of God, to be an instrument of handing on that Word. One important day for me has been the Christmas feast. And the importance is that I've had a chance to celebrate really the four masses that comprise that Christmas feast. There's the Christmas Eve Mass, the late afternoon Mass, and then there's the midnight Mass, and then there's the early morning Mass, the Mass at dawn, and then there's the Mass at midday. And each one of those 4 is a unique and distinct celebration. Each one of those 4 has a flavor its own. And what that has allowed me to do on that one day is to preach 4 times, but to preach 4 different homilies. A homily that reflects both the theme and the spirit and the word of each of one of those 4 Christmas celebrations. A large chunk of not only my priesthood but my life has been taken up with education, and specifically with Catholic education. From age 5 on to today, age 80, in those 75 years, there wasn't a single time, there wasn't a single week when I was not connected with a Catholic school. Whether it was at the parish level, or it was high school, was college. Incarnation and St. Matthew's obviously had wonderful elementary schools. I also had the privilege of participating in the life of Brady High School in West St. Paul and Regina High School in Minneapolis. I taught for a bit at as an extra person at St. Thomas Academy. I taught both at St. Thomas College and at St. Catherine's, off and on courses. So it was a broad spectrum from child care to graduate school opportunities. And all of that has been just a daily part of my life. I don't know if I could think about my life and not have that component as being a part of it. And most recently was the participation in the establishment of a regional Catholic school. As 3 parishes, St. Matthew's and St. John Vianney in South St. Paul and St. Michael's in West St. Paul, as we came together and we formed this regional Catholic school, Community of Saints. We found that to be advantageous. We found that to be financially responsible. We found that to be using our resources, limited resources, in the best way we possibly could. And my participation has been at Community of Saints has been the sacramental minister to the students and to the faculty, and then to participate in what is known as alums and friends, alums and family and friends, an annual fundraising effort that seeks to raise the funds to allow those young people who come from very, very low-income families, many of them, allow them to come to a Catholic school. That fundraising pays off what individuals can't afford for tuition. And we're about to reach the $3 million mark as what we have raised over the past 8 or 9 years. So I'm proud of that, and that's been a strong part of my life. Figures, again, who are important to me. Well, clearly Pope John the 23rd is the originator, the caller, the convener of the Second Vatican Council. I remember as a high school student being in the library at Nazareth Hall one evening, and Monsignor Hayden, the spiritual director, was going through the library, and he stopped at my table and he said, Steve, did you hear that the Pope is calling an ecumenical council? And I said, I don't know what an ecumenical council is. And so he reached behind himself and he picked a book off the shelf by a priest by the name of Hughes, and it was the history of the ecumenical councils. And he handed it to me. And he says, you read this. You need to read this, because what's going to happen is going to be the most significant thing in your religious life ever. Well, I mean, that's really scared me. I should find out about this thing. So those years of living through the council, as the council was happening, were incredibly powerful years for seminary students. There was always something new that was occurring. In our particular seminary, many of the priests would go out in the morning and they would cover masses in various parishes around the area. And there was always one whose job was to come by the newsstand and to pick up a copy of the New York Times. And so after breakfast, we would go to the bulletin board and then we'd cut out all the articles in the New York Times about the Vatican Council. And we'd just stand there and read this stuff. Well, it really opened up a sense of the bigger church, that the church was much more than what we experienced day in and day out. I had the opportunity on the 40th anniversary of the document on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, to participate in a symposium that took place at the Vatican to mark that 40th anniversary. St. Thomas University was one of the institutions that was sponsoring this event. And I prepared a paper that talked about how that teaching about the church in the world would have affected and did affect one particular Catholic church community on the west side of St. Paul. So it was kind of a story of how we struggle to implement that within our own lives. And there were about 250 participants in the symposium. There were also a couple dozen of the national ambassadors to the Vatican who participated, who were present for it. A fair number of the residential College of Cardinals was present for it. So it was Pope John Paul was supposed to be the convener of it, but he was ill at the time. This was very close to the time he died, and so he wasn't there, obviously. The event took place over a number of days, and usually about halfway through the morning and halfway through the afternoon there was a coffee break. There was a time to stretch your legs, and so you'd go out into the large rotunda area, and there would be coffee, and there'd be juice, and there'd be little bits of cake, and all of that kind of thing, and it was kind of it was nice. Well, as I was standing in line, as I was getting my coffee and my cookie, Cardinal Ratzinger came up to me. And Cardinal Ratzinger was he's a rather short man, big head of white hair, pure white hair. And he said to me, "Now, who are you?" And I told him my name, and he said, "Well, where are you from?" And I said, "Well, from St. Paul, Minneapolis." "Ah, St. Thomas University in St. Paul, Minneapolis." I said, "No, not St. Thomas University. I'm not a teacher at the university." "Ah, the University Church at St. Thomas. You are pastor there." No. I said, "I have nothing at all to do with St. Thomas." I said, I'm pastor of a parish that is across the river from St. Thomas. And there was this troubled look that came over his face. And he looked at me intently and he said, "Well, if you aren't from the university, why would you be here?" Well, that took me by surprise. Clearly he was an educator, and he thought that most ideas came through educators and not through people on the street. But within the next couple weeks, he was elected Pope. This was 2005. And so I had the privilege of being dissed by the Pope on his way to the papacy. That he was able to flick his finger at me. And I cherished that. I cherished that a great deal. It was, in retrospect, a wonderful moment. Other people who have been influential in my life have certainly been Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton died 2 days after I was ordained. I had read Merton through the seminary. And he died in December of '68, tragically. And so his writing and his life, his experience of reflective prayer was important to me. And then Dorothy Day. I really had a love affair with Dorothy Day. She was just a great, great figure. I never had the opportunity to meet her, although there were people here in this parish who did have connections with her, because she came to the Twin Cities. She came to St. Paul any number of times, and she would stay with people. And she would have evening gatherings, and people would talk to her. And so I remember this parish who told me that they were participants in that. Dorothy Day's, her writings, her courage, her stamina, her conviction about the corporal works of mercy are so very, very strong for me. I had the opportunity a number of years ago to participate with a very small group of people in drafting the guidelines for the schools of social work for St. Catherine's and St. Thomas, and really part of that whole drafting was incorporating the Catholic social teaching, and particularly the teaching around the corporal works of mercy. And Dorothy's writing and Dorothy's example was very important to the people who were in this group, who were doing this work. And it was then that I found out that Addie Bethune had been the artist who for decades provided the artwork for Dorothy's newspaper, The Catholic Worker. And all of Addie Bethune's stuff, all of her estate, is at St. Catherine's. So they've got a huge section of their library that is dedicated to the material that Addie Bethune produced. But Addie Bethune's certainly had a much bigger artistic history. But for most Catholics, that history is connected to Dorothy Day and to the woodcuts that were so prominent and continue to be prominent in Dorothy's newspaper, The Catholic Worker. When I was a child, I was really taken by the stories of 1001 Arabian Nights, and the image of that Middle Eastern life. The fantasy that developed for me was strong, and I had a huge hunger to experience that personally. I wanted to experience the seven towers, the seven pillars of that are found in Jordan. T.S. Lawrence's seven pillars. I wanted to be able to walk the land, and to see the sky, to see to take in the environmental spirit. You know, there's almost nothing there that is actually the place where something happened in the life of Christ or in the life of the early church. Those places have been worked over, and there are various suggestions as to where things might have happened. So that never ever excited me greatly. But to be in the place, to be in the land, to feel the heat of the day and the cold of the night, to see the stars from the desert floor in the dark of night. It's such a wonderful expanse of glory. As I saw those stars, I wondered, oh, no, is this what the shepherds saw as they were tending their sheep by night outside in the hill country? Did they look up and did they see this canopy of light that was there? And then added to that, the gift of the angel. Well, I decided I was going to go, and I was going to take this opportunity and to visit the Middle East, to visit Israel and Jordan, Syria and Lebanon and Egypt. I decided to take the month of October in 1996 to do that. I left on the 1st of October and returned on Halloween, the last of October. And during that time, I had the chance to spend some time in Israel and some time in Jordan, some time in Syria, a little bit of time in Egypt, and in Lebanon. I left Minneapolis on the 1st of October and arrived in Tel Aviv. I collected my luggage and went and I did some changing of money and then went looking for a cab. And a cab was readily available at the curb, and I got in the cab and I told the cab driver, take me to Jerusalem. And he said, where in Jerusalem? And I said, well, you pick where we should go. I said, I need to go to a hotel. And he said, well, what hotel? And I said, I have no idea. I made no plans about a hotel. You know the area. You drop me off at a nice hotel. And that really was, if you will, the image of what I was going to do for the next 30 days. That I had no itinerary. I knew what I wanted to see. I didn't know how I was going to see it. I didn't know when I was going to see it. I wanted to spend some time in Israel. I wanted to spend some time in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan. Those places that the Old and New Testament reflect on, where those events took place. What is so important to the people of Israel and so important to the plan of God is the land, the gift of the land. That land is not only the nation of Israel today, but that land spills over into the neighboring areas of Jordan and Lebanon and then, of course, in the Old Testament, the place of Egypt is a strong piece of the plan that God had for people. So I wanted to connect with the land. I wanted to connect with the atmosphere of the physical space. I also had the chance to spend some time visiting and seeing how people live their lives. I had the time to spend 2 days with a nomadic family in the Arabian desert. Now, the family is the extended family. This is grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles and cousins. This is dozens and dozens of people. And they live in this huge tent. I mean, this tent just went on and on and on, this black tent in the middle of the desert. There was a young man there, Hamed, and he had studied English in school, and he was so eager to have conversation with me because he wanted to practice his English. He had no one to talk to in English. There was no other person in the family who had studied English. And so we spent some time. In the course of our conversation, I found out that I was really the first Christian that he has had a long conversation with. That his faith community was totally Muslim. But he talked to me about what he knew about the Jesus, he called him. What he knew about the Jesus. And so I took my rosary out of my pocket and I held it up for him, and his eyes just expanded and he cried out, "That's the Jesus, that's the Jesus." Well, I gave him the rosary, and he was so grateful to receive that he had a piece of art of the Jesus. Now, these people lived very simply. There was, they didn't have any of the amenities of our lives, except the cell phone. They had cell phones, and they had opportunities to connect to the internet. Now, how did they do this? Outside this tent was a rusted out Ford Fairlane 500. It certainly wouldn't drive, but it would sit there and the battery worked. And so you could use the battery of that car. You could start it up, and that became a source of power. And so once I got back to the States, it was not infrequent, I mean, a couple times a month, I'd receive an email from this young man. It was a piece of the journey, a piece of the trek that was a surprise to me and happened, and it was a grace. It was a gift. I had the opportunity to meet a young man who was with the United Nations. He was a military person. He was staying in the same hotel that I was in Tel Aviv. And we spent a little bit of time together. We ate a couple of meals together. And he said to me, he said, I'm leaving tomorrow. I've got to go into Jordan, into Lebanon, and would you like to go with me? And I said, certainly, I'd love to go with you. So the next morning, he and I took off in his Jeep. It was this white Jeep with the UN insignia all around it. And he said, we're going to be able to get where we want to go because this is a UN item, and so it gets passed through a lot of places that normally people would have to answer questions for. So as we approached the border between Israel, the northern part of Israel, and Lebanon, there was this cafe, and we stopped for coffee there. And it was after that we got into the Jeep and continued on. Now, all the while, there was the sound of military conflict going on, the sound of gunfire, the sound of missiles exploding, the sound of war. And clearly that was going on at the time. Clearly there was there were the military skirmishes that were taking place between Israel and Arab countries. Well, we entered into Lebanon and we traveled for a while, and the sound of the armaments became more and more and more and closer and closer. And the Swedish young man pulled off to the side, and he said, I can't go any further. He said, I can't take you anymore. He said, you don't really have the sanction to be covered under the UN. I'm just taking you along. If something were to happen, I'd be responsible, and I'd get into a lot of trouble. So I'm going to take you back. And so he did. We turned around and we went back. And we traveled about 45 minutes, and then we crossed the border into Israel, northern Israel. And that cafe, that coffee shop that we had stopped in just hours earlier, it didn't exist anymore. It had been bombed. It was rubble. It was a powerful first-hand experience of what that conflict between Arabs and Israelis is all about, and how that conflict can affect families and communities and people powerfully. As pastor of St. Matthew's Church, I sought to encourage this community to open not only its financial support, but also the recesses it had, the property it had, the space it had, that we would open that up to serve the broader community. And there was the opportunity to welcome a loaves and fishes site here at St. Matthew's. There had been a site at Neighborhood House, but they redid their mission, and that no longer fit in. So with the help of a number of churches, it was established here at St. Matthew's, but it didn't happen easily. You see, if we're going to have the site here, that means that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, from 3:30 in the afternoon until 6:30 in the evening or 7 o'clock in the evening, there can't be anything else that goes on there, because this is the time that the food is prepared and the people are fed and the cleanup takes place. Well, that social hall was the place in which the parish carried on all of its activities. The men's club met there, the Rosary Society met there, the Scouts met there, the senior citizens met there. There was always something going on there, and so what had to happen was there had to be the decision on the part of the various groupings of the parish, the decision to really step back and to reorganize the way in which they were carrying on their activities, to make room for, to make space for the loaves and fishes. And it took about a year. It took about a year, and there was careful conversation and back and forth and opportunities to shake things down. And finally there was a decision, yes, we're going to do this. And we're going to create some space for this to happen. Well, a similar event happened in the parish center when we had the opportunity to receive and to house one of the clinics. That meant we had to find space for that, and we had to do some renovation. We had to prepare some spaces that could be examining rooms. And so there were codes that had to be met. And on Wednesday, when the clinic took place, it meant that nothing else could happen there. Because the rooms off the corridor were examining rooms. The large room was the place where people met and where the intake was done. And the small room off to the side was where the medications were kept in a locked box, and the doctors and nurses would gather in there and consult with each other. And so it was a full operation. And it was meant for people who were uninsured or had very little insurance. It was also basic medicine. So people didn't feel well, people had a fever, an individual had a persistent cough, a person had been injured and needed to have bandages changed, needed to have blood pressure taken, needed to have some very basic medical things. For more serious things, though, these people would be referred to other clinics or the local hospitals, down to United Hospital or St. Joseph's Hospital. And this was all done by the St. Joseph Sisters. They were the ones who underwrote this. When they sold St. Mary's Hospital in Minneapolis, they decided to use the proceeds to really do what their original mission was, to provide some health care for very low income or very poor people. And those St. Mary's clinics were established in order to do that. So the people who came in off the street, they got good service. They got immediate service at the clinic, and then if they needed a referral, either for a dentist or another kind of medical person, they got that referral, and they didn't have to pay for it. They didn't have to, it was covered. But the most important thing, what they came for, was their medications. They couldn't afford their pills. And again, what the sisters would do, they would underwrite the cost of the medications for these people. And so a person would come in who didn't have a particular illness or difficulty, but their blood pressure pills had run out, and they needed their blood pressure pills, and they know that they could get a new prescription by coming and talking to the doctor there. So that was a wonderful development and use of the parish facility to benefit the larger community. Now there was a large house, the parish rectory, my house, that was right across the street from the church. It was just a huge house. I think it had something like 7 bathrooms in the house. I mean, it was all kinds of space in the place. And I ended up living there alone. Well, I mean, that was obscene. Well, first of all, you know, I could sleep every night of the week in a different room. You know, there was that kind of space. So I stepped back from the house and we looked for a way in which that house could be used again for the benefit of the community. And the theme or the image of Dorothy Day and houses of hospitality was certainly strong in the discussion and the desire on the part of people. The house needed an awful lot of work. The house had not been tended to very well. And the work got done. There was close to $500,000 put into that house. It was sweat equity work by union people. It was gifts by businesses, Lowe's and Menards and those places. They contributed the cabinets in the kitchen, the appliances in the kitchen, so much of what was needed. So that there was an awful lot of value that was put into that house to make it really a quality place and a place that really could welcome up to 16 people as residents in the house. Presently, the house is used as a shelter for those undocumented individuals who are waiting for their hearings, their immigration hearings, and they can't work. They have no means of getting support for themselves. So the purpose of the house is to provide some shelter for those individuals, some food and shelter for them, as well as then to provide opportunities for them to do some studying, some language studying or some studying with regard to trade, so that they could grow to be able to handle their own lives as they pass through the immigration system. And again, the parish was very accepting of that and grew into seeing it as a part of who they were. That this effort to provide for the traveler, for the immigrant, for the outsider, for the person on the margin, for the person who has no place to go, no place to be, no place to lay his head, that became a strong piece of living out the message of the gospel. So those are some of the ways in which over the years this parish has chosen to use what it has. It doesn't have a ton of money, but it has a lot of room, a lot of space. And that space can be offered and made available to the community. In the early 90s, the Wilder Foundation underwrote an opportunity for the West Side community, the whole West Side of St. Paul, to enter into a planning process. And that process involved the beginning of going door to door and having an opportunity to have a conversation with people in the neighborhood around what it is that they like about the neighborhood, what it is that they don't like about the neighborhood, what it is that they think the neighborhood needs and it doesn't have. And this process took a while. It took months and months to do this. And then all this stuff was brought back, and the heads of various societies and organizations and committees and groups came together to talk about what had emerged in the discussion. Well, the highest priority was that the people wanted a local development company, a local community developer that would do building and rehabbing in the neighborhood in a way that would be what the neighbors wanted, rather than coming in from the outside. The second thing they said is they wanted childcare. And they wanted, if possible, to have childcare for 2 sessions, so that between 6 o'clock in the morning and midnight, childcare would operate, or even later than that. And part of the issue was that there were people in the community who, single moms, who didn't work daytimes, they worked nights. They cleaned offices, or they did that kind of work. And they needed a place for their children. And so what was established was the agreement that St. Matthew's would be the one to, if you will, spearhead the child care. A child care program already existed on St. Matthew's campus, but we're talking about expanding the program. And so the parish undertook that as part of its responsibility. Now, in order to get that done, there had to be the establishment of a community development corporation. And a wonderful man in the neighborhood, Brian Miller, and I were able to put together the work that brought this entity into existence, the Neighborhood Development Alliance. This was the time when Rudy Perpich was governor of the state, and there was a lot of money that flowed into urban areas for development. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth specifically. And there was a chunk of money that was available for hard development, brick and mortar development, as well as for community development, the soft development. And we applied for, and we fought for, and we got funds. We got funds to build buildings, to rehab existing housing stock, to rejuvenate housing stock, to build a community, to try to build a community that was incredibly diverse and yet very much connected. So that diverse not only by ethnicity or race or culture or language, but also diverse in terms of economic standing. That people of rather modest means could live very close to people who had, quite a bit. And their children would go to school together, and they would be on the same ball team with each other. And there would be a sense of both families, both groups, having invested in the neighborhood. And that was the dream, and in a very real sense, that was what we worked on. Brian was a person of tremendous enthusiasm, but also imagination. He encouraged people, there are all kinds of old houses around here that used to have front porches. They don't have front porches anymore because Anderson Window has closed all that stuff in, and so now it's not a porch anymore. And he encouraged people to take down the screens and to open up the porches and to sit on the porches, to sit out there in the spring and the summer, and to read their newspaper and to howdy their neighbors as they went by, and in a sense to try to build up that community spirit that was there at one time, where adults sat together on the porch and the kids played ball in the middle of the street, and somebody had the Twins on the radio and was piped, if you will, through the window, and to try to recreate that sense of community. And what we knew was that happened spontaneously. In the 40s and the 50s, that happened spontaneously. It can happen again, but it has to be intentional. It's not going to happen by its own. And so the encouragement was for people to really begin to see in a brick and mortar way, in a physical way, how they could advance the life of a community. Well, the child care became a central piece of the work of the Neighborhood Development Alliance, and that child care was able to operate initially largely because of the grants that came from the federal and state government. there was a desire to underwrite programs over 3 or 4 years' time, hoping that people could get on their own feet in 3 or 4 years' time, but to underwrite programs that would be of benefit to neighbors and benefit to community, and that after 1,000 days of this, that the community would take some ownership for it. They would see how important it was to them, and I'm really very proud of what has happened with the Development Alliance and the Neighborhood Development Alliance. And you know, it's still going. It's still operating. I don't have anything to do with it anymore, and Brian doesn't have anything to do with it anymore, but it's gone on to other generations of people who are participating in. And the goal is still the housing stock of the community, to rehab that, and then to tie it into advancing the needs of community. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit and listen to me ramble on and on and on and on. It's really important for me to be able to tell those stories, and in a sense, through that, to give you thanks. To say my life has really been a collage of interactions with hundreds and thousands of people, and you who are viewing this are part of that. In April I will turn 80 years old, and I always wondered who'd want to be 80 years old. You know? When Dwight Eisenhower celebrated his 80th birthday, he said the same thing. He said, you know, as I grew up, I thought 80 years old was really old, and I wondered who'd want to live that long. And he said, I finally found out. It's a guy who's 79. He wants to see 80.